Good afternoon, Ed.
Hi, Mark. How's it going?
Very good, very good. Let's introduce ourselves. I'm Mark Schmitt. I'm a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, and I write a column in the New Republic and try to write in as many other places as I can.
And I'm Dan Foster, news editor at National Review, online, I should say. And we're going to start by talking about somebody who I desperately hoped I'd never have to talk about ever again, which is Donald Trump. On the news,
I thought you were going to say George W. Bush.
No, although he's in an ancillary way related to all this. Trump just went after Karl Rove today, calling him a loser, and among other things. That's after he called Bush evil in 2008. Now he's some sort of folk hero among a small but unfortunately real rump of the GOP primary electorate.
You've got a good dossier on him.
Right, yeah. So he's agreed to, or has been tapped to, moderate a Newsmax debate in Iowa a week before the primary. So a debate potentially with some juice, although it's on the Ion channel, which I don't think is on many more cable boxes than whatever channel Keith Olbermann wound up on. Which came?
What is Ion? I don't know what Ion channel is. Is that a conservative counterpart?
It's I have Ion, or I did growing up. It's like a kind of a Hallmarky. Yeah, it's a ABC Family sort of thing. Old family friendly movie reruns, things like that. I shouldn't go out on a limb too far in case I'm misrepresenting them, but that was my impression of it. So anyway, he's gonna moderate this debate, which I think is a terrible thing. And really, really bad for the...
Does he get to fire people at the end of it?
He's not going to fire people, but he is going to give an endorsement immediately after the debate. So it will very much have the feeling of a reality TV show, as if that were something that the GOP primary were lacking thus far. I think all sides kind of agree that this is taken on a circus-like atmosphere, which was actually Ron Paul's words. And the Ron Paul's campaign, bizarre as it is, had a perfectly spot-on, tonally perfect response to the Gingrich invite, and they RSVP'd in the negative. And his staff said basically, "This is."
You mean the Trump invite? You said the Gingrich invite.
Oh, I apologize. Yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. The Trump invite. Ron Paul's campaign basically said this is beneath the presidency and beneath anybody who would serve that office, and that it's going to distract from the real issues and create, perpetuate this, as I said, circus-like atmosphere. And I think that is right on. And Trump is a guy, I'll just do a little spiel here because I really dislike this guy. I wrote a piece when there was when he was supposedly exploring a presidential bid, what seems like 50 years ago, but was sadly much more recently than that. And the opening anecdote of that piece, and I think it's kind of both a brilliant little piece of bluffing by Trump, but also really paradigmatic of the kind of guy he is that, he was developing, I forget whether it was the Taj Mahal in Atlantic City or one of his other casinos, but he was developing some big project and he was out of money. And he had barely any money he didn't have enough money to move forward. So what he did was he took the scraps that he had and he hired a bunch of backhoe, major earth-moving machines, and he had them move dirt from one side of the lot to the other. And he would bring in potential investors, and he would say, "Look, this thing is going 1,000 miles an hour. If you want to get in, you got to get in now, or you're going to miss the train." So that was early in his career, and he pulled it off in that instance. And as we know, he's come back from half a dozen, 50, 60, 100 bankruptcies. Who knows how many at this point? But the point of the piece that I wrote, and I think it's on fine display the last couple of days, is that this guy is first and foremost a bluffer. He bluffs. That's what he does for a living. And his exploration for a presidential race was a bluff. And you saw, when he was, flirting with running for office, the birther stuff, the really deplorable birther stuff that he flirted with. He claimed that he had gumshoes on the ground in Hawaii investigating the president's birth. I don't believe that was ever true. He said that he knows people in the White House who would be terrified of him running against Obama. Nobody believes that that's true. So the guy is, I won't say he's a liar because I think he's not particularly concerned about the truth. He just knows how rumors can move markets. That's kind of the basis of his career. And so just today we saw him, I saw a story in Huffington Post about him getting into a fight with Chuck Todd this morning. I don't know if you saw that, but if you watch the video, he's he's doing his impression of a conservative arguing with somebody on MSNBC, because he sees that arguing with somebody on MSNBC is the sort of thing you should do if you want to be well liked by conservatives. And so he kind of apes getting ticked off at Chuck Todd, who I don't think anyone's ever been ticked off at ever, besides maybe Jay Carney. And he kind of yells at him and doesn't make much sense and kind of invents a conflict where there isn't one. And it's embarrassing. And to sum up, his presence, even on the periphery of the Republican Party, I think is embarrassing. And it's something that should be avoided by these candidates. I mean, I get the sense that we're not going to disagree much on this.
No, I'm not. I try. I would love to be able to come up with a great defense of Donald Trump, but I really can't. Let me ask you something. Did he like create this debate, or did Newsmax approach him about?
It sounds
moderating this debate?
Yeah, it sounds like Newsmax approached him about moderating it. And Newsmax is an interesting vehicle. It's a big and well circulated, attempt in print to create a kind of alternative to the mainstream media. That's an overused term. And so a Newsmax debate in Iowa actually makes a lot of sense. I just don't know where, Trump comes into it. And I just don't think there's any good reason for him to be there. I don't think he will make an effective moderator. I'm sympathetic to complaints with my friends on the right that the moderation of a lot of these debates has been terrible, although the guy who I expected to be the worst was Wolf Blitzer, and I think he actually turned out to be the best moderator so far. So it's not
I thought he was fine, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not like it's impossible to find a competent, interesting, and balanced moderator in the mainstream media. But I'm sympathetic to the idea that, okay, we should be looking for some...
Well, one rule for a moderator, I should say, the number one skill, I often moderate panels, and I think I'm pretty good at it, and the one thing you need to know to do that is, kind of check your ego at the door. You're not there to talk. You can interject in order to move a conversation along a little bit, but that's not your role, and I don't think... That's not that Donald Trump would not be high on my list of people I think could play that somewhat passive role.
If he checked his ego at the door, the only thing that would be left
there'd be nothing left. Right. I think that's good. But the interesting thing is it's interesting how the different ways, if you look at you think of him as having been a potential candidate, the kind of business people who people in the Republican Party have been attracted to. None of them are quite the great, entrepreneur, build a company up from scratch that, is the sort of icon of Republican mythology. I mean, Trump, he goes bankrupt all the time. It's all bluster. He actually makes more money putting his name on buildings that he doesn't actually build than he does as a builder. I mean, he's not really he's not in, he's barely in the top 50 of New York real estate. I think it's according to Cranes or one of those New York business things. He's really not a very significant developer anymore. But because he just does this, he just gets his name out there wherever he can. The name itself has some value, and that's all he's really selling at this point. And now he's selling it in various ways in the Republican Party or in the cable networks or in reality shows. And then, of course, Romney made his money in an interesting way. That's not. I mean, there was a company that got built up, but mostly it was a company that invested in and either built up or pared down a lot of other companies. And Kane actually has much more the really traditional business career, although he really hasn't been in that business for almost 20 years since he took over the National Restaurant Association. So it's a funny, the business icons are all interesting variations, I guess, on the model.
I would say about Kane, Kane's time at Godfather Pizza being what it was, it was a medium-sized sort of regional corporation. It was a big corporation, but it was,
right.
And he, by all accounts, did a fairly good job there. But he also spent a lot of time, as you said, as essentially a lobbyist. And people forget that he was a member of and then chairman of a regional Fed board.
Right.
So he spent plenty of time. That's kind of irking me about his whole campaign as being a Washington outsider. Well, if you were a Washington outsider, you wouldn't have run for office 3 times. We ran exactly.
Yeah.
He lost a Republican primary. Flirted with a presidential run. In the past, and as you said, he was a lobbyist for so many years.
Well, that's much more egregious about Romney. Romney says, "I've never had a political career," and the guy, he started running. He changed from independent to Republican in 1993 to run against Ted Kennedy, and he's basically been running for office ever since then, with a brief interlude to run the Salt Lake City Olympics.
Well, he ran in '94. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. He ran in '94 and lost, and then he didn't run again until he was elected governor of Massachusetts.
Until 2002, he didn't.
Yeah.
He didn't formally.
So I mean, Romney, I'll buy it, and I do think his model of success is more interesting than and more traditional also than Trump's. I mean, he was an innovator in the sense that he actually was one of the pioneers of that private equity model. The way, the way that he would invest in companies. And yeah, he laid off a bunch of people and all those familiar controversies. But Romney, I'll kind of give a pass on being a career politician. I think you'd have a lot more career politicians if these people had, if it were easier to win office. So a lot of these guys, like Kane, Romney, ran and lost. And so that's probably why he, his resume is not his political resume is not as long as even Romney would like it to be. And Romney's going to be interesting to see with this Trump thing because the big name. So Santorum and Bachmann have said yes, and both those cases, as we say in our editorial at NRO this morning, both those cases are kind of understandable, if no less unfortunate, because Bachmann's kind of sleeping in the bed that she made. She's been an avowed Trump fan for a while now. She's got to say yes. Santorum is not really in a position to say no to anybody.
Right. And both of them have staked everything on Iowa.
Say again?
Both of them have staked everything on Iowa.
Right. That's
it's Iowa or nothing for both of them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That so this is at a particularly highly levered point pre-Iowa. Although somebody also made the point that it's on 2 days after Christmas, and again on the Ion channel, which I may or may not be identifying correctly. So it might not be that might not see that big of an audience, but perhaps we'll see a really big audience in Iowa. We can only assume. But the really glaring one to me, and we can sort of swing to talking about Newt in general, is that Newt so early and so enthusiastically agreed to be a part of this debate, and more so, furthermore, he's kind of embraced Trump, and he met with him today, and Trump said their meeting went really well, and he's a smart guy, and Gingrich has said, how can you say no to the Donald, and everyone was making terrible jokes about this being a presidential apprentice, and Gingrich, kind of obliviously said, think about it, this will be just like the presidential apprentice. So he's been almost inexplicably enthusiastic about this whole thing, and it fits into...
Well, they're similar characters. They're both blowhards.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Bluffers.
And I think, though, I see his angle. This whole Newt phenomenon is really interesting. I think there's 1,000 different threads to pull on, but I guess his angle in the debate is that he knows he's a really good debater. He knows he's a threat to Romney in Iowa, and he's a threat to win Iowa, frankly, and that he's kind of daring, especially Romney, but all of his other opponents, to say no when he's so quickly come out and embraced this and said yes. But just a real... I hope Romney says no. I hope everybody else who's still on the fence says no. But but so what's your take on Gingrich in general? I've been kind of trying to figure out publicly on the corner for the last month whether this is for real, whether it's explicable in the same terms as first Bachmann, then Perry, then Kane. The anti-Newt, the anti-Mitt terms. Or whether it's something fundamentally different as a political phenomenon. What's your take?
Well, I think it's I think it is a little different from Bachmann and Perry, which it was all just kind of the idea of them as somebody who was distinctly more conservative. It's very interesting to me because I don't think that Gingrich fits perfectly into the sort of classic Tea Party conservative mold. I'm not sure why they would trust him as a real conservative more than they would trust Romney. Basically, they both have the habit of whatever seems opportune at the moment is what's going to come out of their mouth, and that's not true obviously for Bachmann or Perry. probably also not for Kane. I don't know. I mean, why is it that somebody like, Santorum's been in Iowa day in and day out? He's got the perfect profile. He served 2 full terms in the Senate. I mean, there's nothing obvious. He's not unqualified. He handles himself well. I think he's done fine in debates also. There's no, and I don't like Rick Santorum, but I don't know why it is that he just doesn't seem to have clicked at all in the state, and Gingrich has taken off. It can't be all that people are watching debates. I mean, maybe people are watching, maybe either people are watching debates or the message is getting out that here Newt Gingrich, and he's a guy who's handles himself perfectly and is a great alternative to Romney. But I'm not sure why it is.
I think that the Santorum thing, I agree with you that there's a missing 10 or 15, maybe 10% in the polls for Santorum that I really can't explain. I don't think he would ever been a favorite, and I think he's hurting a lot because in the debates he does come across as screechy and whiny and just really kind of berates everybody he gets a chance to, and I think that's mattered. But it's also the fact that his credentials are mainly on social conservative issues, and though that's always a big factor in Iowa, this is not a culture war election first and foremost. It's but I do think that there's a missing handful of percentage points for Santorum that are really tough to account for. They should be there, especially at this point. Huntsman is an interesting case too, because I never thought I'd see the day, and believe me, I don't think there's a Huntsman surge around the corner, but I never thought I'd see the day where prominent members of the right, especially blogosphere, are kind of tentatively, from Eric Erickson to James Pethokoukis to Ala Pundit, who's a really influential grassroots conservative pundit, they're all sort of saying more or less, with more or less commitment and more or less passion, well, maybe we should take a second look at Huntsman. I don't think it's going to happen.
Right.
But it is true that Huntsman's credentials are, and everyone knows this, are fairly conservative. I mean, I joked today that imagine if he also was very forceful in saying no to Trump. I mean, his campaign's response actually started out with LOL, their official on the record response. So he's been very forceful. And I said, I kind of like that because I don't like Trump. We both don't like Trump, it seems. I kind of like that, but unfortunately, Huntsman didn't reserve his contempt for the likes of Donald Trump. He used it on about 98-99% of the GOP electorate. And if he hadn't just run this campaign of basically contempt for the base, and I know he's counting on New Hampshire and he's counting on open primary states, but that's not how you play this game. There's a reason why run right, tax center has always been the strategy to win as a Republican candidate. So I mean, but imagine if he had played the game right. But there's another version of that question you could ask about Gingrich, which is Gingrich, landed face first when he launched his campaign. He spent a week in Hawaii spending fundraised dollars. Imagine if this guy, he lost 3/4 of his staff. Imagine if he had actually been running for president. Every indication was that this guy was on a book tour.
Exactly.
And imagine if he had actually been running for president.
Right, and I'm perfectly willing to believe that he started off on a book tour.
Yeah.
But at some point, I think it does become. At some point, either it already has or it will kind of catch up with him. And I don't know what happens. I mean, if you have Romney actually competing in Iowa, which my general belief is nobody in both parties, people should never just stay out of Iowa. But you have Romney actually competing in Iowa, and if Newt Gingrich and Ron Paul come in 1 and 2 in Iowa, where does the Romney campaign go? Do they just run the table after that? I don't know.
It'll be really interesting because we already know that Gingrich won't be on the Missouri ballot, and
we already know he missed some slates.
Yeah. And I hear rumblings that he won't be on that he's missed a lot of other deadlines, and this gets back to imagine if he were running for president. So if this turns into, I'm not convinced by the Obama-Hillary parallels that's quickly becoming the new narrative. I saw a couple things on that, but.
The parallel being that Obama did a better job at that kind of dealing with the caucus states and that kind of ground level organizing.
Right, yeah, and just and was able to represent something a little, and kind of gave red meat to the base in a way that Hillary didn't. And so I mean, this thing could go long. I mean, that's I would not have thought that. So that's why as I said, I've been trying to publicly exercise my demons in understanding where Gingrich came from and what it means to the for the primary. But that's where I just don't know. I think on the one hand, it is the not Mitt thing, but in all of the previous iterations of it, it was, the metaphor I use is like the guys you date versus the guy you marry, and all the previous iterations, it was flirtations with these other candidates, and then as political gravity took effect, they were one by one brought to earth.
Right, Bachman to bed, Romney to wed.
There you go. I'm glad you said it, not me. And so, but an important part of that dynamic was that with each successive failure, I think the big block of the conservative electorate that was dissatisfied with Romney accustomed themselves more to the idea that they would hold their nose and go vote for him because maybe he seems like the most electable or just
that did seem like it was happening 3 weeks ago. That seemed like it was.
That seemed like it was happening. So this is what I also asked the hypothetical question. Now imagine that their roles had been reversed, and I set up an elaborate. You can we'll have Blogging Heads put the little link to this post in the top right of your screen. So I won't go through the whole hypothetical, but I think it's really plausible that if a few things had changed and Gingrich had been running for president since 2006. And Romney emerged after a few years, getting his Nixon on, being tan, rested, and ready. He would have become the anti-Newt. I mean, there are, I think, really conceivable close counterfactuals where Romney comes out, and people think Newt's establishment, and they think Romney's this interesting executive. Yeah. I mean, I think that's entirely plausible. So how to explain that? And I think he's catching some of that anti-Mitt, or really just anti-inevitable candidate, because the base is feeling frisky. But he's also, the danger of Newt is that even without political organization, and even with all of the skeletons in his closet, he's smart enough that he might be able to pull this off. I mean, you might disagree with that. I know you don't think particularly highly of him, but I mean, consider the fact that there's probably not one. We saw Coburn, who served with Newt, say bad things about him. We saw Lindsey Graham, who it's impossible to get him to say bad things about anyone, get kind of close to saying bad things about Newt, also served under him in the House. And Boehner's not nuts over him. Dick Armey hates his guts. There are a ton of people who served under Newt in the '94 Revolution that despise him.
Absolutely. If there's any kind of Republican establishment, they are going. They're saying we have to stop this thing, and we don't care if it can be Romney, it can be Huntsman. We don't care.
Right. There's a whole bunch of people who are wishing that now that there is in fact a vast right-wing conspiracy, and it gets to work dismantling Gingrich. But I mean, and that'll make him really. I mean, you can only imagine how effective he'll be as a president dealing with Congress if we think President Obama's had a rough go of it. But I'm very.
I really don't want to think about President Gingrich. I think that's a very, very dangerous thing to think about.
From your point of view, you don't think it would at least be entertaining?
I think it would be very entertaining, but I do think we live in very scary times, and entertainment, if you want entertainment, we can have Donald Trump. I really don't want an entertaining president.
Well, I'm torn. I mean, because I will buy this. So the standard line that reluctant Gingrich support, and the weird demographic, and just anecdotally from the emails that I get and the reader comments I read, the unusual demographic is that there are people who are very much aware that Gingrich is a consummate Washington insider, and who are very much anti-Romney because they think that he's an establishment hack. And so they've drawn this distinction between insiderdom and establishment. And what they're really ticked off about is not that anyone would have spent time in Washington. They're really ticked off that there would be a candidate anointed by party elites. Right. So in that scenario, the fact that people despise Gingrich in Washington becomes an asset for him.
Right.
And I do think, and the most common argument I hear from these sorts of people is that, we just want to see him, not we just, but we want to see him kick Obama's ass in debates, and we think that'll be really, definitive, and he'll be able to set the, articulate the ideas in a way that, Romney can't. And that's why you saw this clamoring for Christie and this clamoring for Rubio, not just because they're, interesting and compelling figures, but because they're very effective communicators, each in their own way. And so what you might see in the support for Gingrich is that we don't care if he's got 1,000 ideas a minute. He can communicate them. He can communicate a kind of the broad contours of a vision in a way that we just don't think Romney can. And I think that's true. I mean, I'm not supposed to back any candidates, and I haven't, and I take that fairly seriously. But I'm torn just from an analytical perspective on whether Gingrich could be a really formidable nominee. I mean, every bone in my body says no. He would make it a, he would widen, he'd make it a laugher. But sometimes
I mean, the guy had some incredible successes in his. I worked on the Hill in '94. I remember all of it very well, and really, was very much observed the rise of Gingrich. I mean, he definitely had some incredible successes, and part of it was. The thing that he's always been best at, actually, is actually challenging the Republican establishment to do things in a different way, which is not necessarily to be more conservative. I mean, one of the things that I always thought was very interesting about Gingrich's rise in the late 80s and early 90s was that a lot of his strong supporters were actually more moderate Republicans. Folks like Nancy Johnson from Connecticut. It wasn't that they didn't necessarily want their party to be more conservative, but they wanted it to be more lively and engaged and idea-driven than it was, and passionate than the sort of kind of complacent minority that it had been. And I thought I always thought that was a very interesting element of his appeal. And obviously, what a lot of grassroots Republicans are looking for now is a stylistic challenge to the Republican establishment, which sometimes they can get it from inside, like from a Paul Ryan, but they're not interested in the world of John Boehner, I think, and I don't think it's necessarily that people could say I want it to be more conservative in the following ways. But that they want an overall change of style, and a lot of that's what a lot of that was. And the Contract for America, of course, was as much a promise of changing the way you did politics as it was specific. I mean, there was stuff in there that was substantive, like balanced budget amendment and so forth, but a lot of it was really just how you do business. So his kind of his kind of constant revolutionary mode, I think, is probably the most appealing thing about him.
I think that's exactly right, and. There's a parallel to this in the current race among Democrats, which is the kind of average Democrat's crush on John Huntsman. And I've thought that like I said, his credentials are fairly conservative, but he laughs at the same jokes that they laugh at, and he thinks global warming deniers are silly. And he went on Jon Stewart and did very well. And a lot of it is just style. I mean, and it's the same reason why Huntsman turns off the conservative base is the reason why the average Democrat who's watching this thing says, "Well, why can't it be somebody sane and smart and reality based and slick and worldly like John Huntsman?" But those
my sane smart Republican candidate can't even get into the debates, which is Gary Johnson.
A Republican, you say, is he?
That's the one I have the crush on.
He's a rhino. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm probably symptomatic of the conservative establishment in that I have absolutely nothing to say about Gary Johnson.
Nothing to say, or nothing good to say?
No, nothing interesting to say. I don't have anything interesting to say. I mean, I barely know who Buddy Roemer is. And I don't, and I don't.
Well, certainly not Buddy. I mean, Buddy Roemer, is crackpot political career from a long time ago. Right. I just find it real. I mean, here you have Gary Johnson, 2 terms as actually a quite popular governor of New Mexico, which is not, it's not the biggest state in the country, but it's, it's only a little bit smaller than Utah. And he did something that, he solved a problem, which is a hard problem to solve, which is how do you actually govern as a libertarian?
Right.
Maybe you can do it in New Hampshire, but, maybe Montana, but a difficult state with a lot of poverty and a lot of different needs, and he actually managed to function as a libertarian. That, to me, that's a big deal. If I were a libertarian, I'm not a libertarian, but if I were, I would think this is totally awesome. I mean, Ron Paul just sat in Congress, and sure, you have votes and you have proposals to get rid of the Fed and things like that, but you never actually have to do anything in Congress. You don't actually have to govern. But Johnson actually did, and I don't know why it's so dismissed.
Well, I think that the people he would appeal to have already been satiated or in the tank for Ron Paul and
For Paul,
have long been there and aren't going anywhere. I mean, Ron Paul has become a personality cult. He's not even the libertarian anymore. He is libertarianism.
Right.
And although there are plenty, I think there are people around here at NR who would consider themselves libertarians before conservatives and who aren't Ron Paul fans. I mean, but
right, and I think that's true of sort of the Reason crowd as well.
Yes, yeah. And although Reason is certainly closer to Ron Paul in foreign policy than they are to us,
right? Absolutely.
And that's obviously one of our big beefs with Paul is just a kind of a dangerously naive foreign policy. But we don't have to get into all of that. And so a part of me wants to see Gingrich as the nominee because just to see if he can pull it off. I mean, I've always described this race as a stoppable force meeting a movable object, and I've used this 1,000 times, but I think it's the perfect image. There's no reason structurally, given his popularity numbers, given the state of the economy, why Barack Obama should be reelected, and there's nobody among his opponents who inspires any confidence that he's the man to beat him. So it's this really weird scenario, and if you put a gun to my head, I'd say probably Obama wins a tight one. But I mean, maybe if if that's the most likely outcome, then why not say what the hell, roll the dice, and send world historic Newt out there and see what he can get done.
Right. I mean, I could see that. Assuming that if you need more than just the economy to move things forward. I mean, I still think from any Democrat's point of view, the basic. You're still going to basically be more afraid that, assuming Romney can get to the nomination, and always stuns me how, his numbers are just consistently really, really low. When he gets 24% in a poll, that's a high point for over the entire 6 years he's been running for president.
Right.
Usually bounces around in that 18% range, which is pretty astonishing for being the one, the best known guy. Because he's on the cover of Parade magazine yesterday.
But correct me if I'm wrong, though. I mean, the 2008 Democratic primary kind of got late early, right? I mean, just as a point of comparison, I mean, the GOP field has kind of stayed at its current size, at least numerically, for the length of it, and everybody's had their little slice of the pie. Even Rick Perry, and Bachmann are hanging around, especially in Iowa, with fairly decent numbers. I mean, I do think that there's a lot of, and this is the dynamic we were talking about earlier. I can't not think that there's a lot of votes that are going to settle on Romney, not even as a second choice, but perhaps as a third choice. Gingrich also upsets that, paradigm. I think, Gingrich should be going balls to the wall trying to get Kane's endorsement because that's actually a real game changer, I think, especially in Iowa. But I still have to think that there's a lot of default Romney voters because that's the way these things shake out, usually. Right. And people forget.
I just think with the default vote, you should be seeing a higher number than 18, 20, really where he is bouncing around somewhere between the high teens and the low 20s. That just seems really...
I mean, I always look at the state-based polls, and those are the only ones I really think are worth anyone's time. The national polls are... I don't understand why they're taken as seriously as they are, but...
Well, they get relevant after a while. I mean, they begin to line up with the state-based polls. It's a couple months ago, their national polls are really irrelevant, but now they start to get relevant, I think.
No, that might be true. But I mean, and the other thing is that people. So we have this issue with Gingrich being on all the ballots. Is he or isn't he? And we have, the idea that, and people forget this, that a lot of these are open primaries. So are they going to be dissatisfied? Because you know how terribly Obama is doing with independents right now. And are there going to be dissatisfied independents who are going to show up and vote for someone like Romney or someone like Huntsman even? What's going to happen on...
Right. It's hard to imagine the same... I mean, I know that group of independents in New Hampshire, they definitely, they made McCain.
Right.
And I think somebody I did blogging heads with, maybe you pointed out that McCain could not have won the nomination with Republicans alone. But, McCain had a certain appeal to those independents that I'm not sure Romney has.
Right, but I think that there's a... and nobody, it's almost like the silent majority. Nobody talks about it because the conservative part of the Republican base is the most fired up right now.
Right.
But there's always been this silent majority, or silent plurality at least, in the Republican base that internalizes the "it's this guy's turn next" view that has always been the way Republicans pick presidential candidates. I mean, Bob Dole being the consummate product of that. So, I mean, I think that partially explains McCain, and that's a huge, I think, factor in terms of inertia, is the nasty way to put it, but momentum is the perhaps nicer way to put it for Romney. And I think it's real. I think that there are a lot more what you would call Rockefeller Republicans who vote in primaries than I think the average person sort of assumes when they're talking about the state of play. So I still have to think that Romney's the favorite, and if you look at InTrade, which is a highly flawed, obviously, marker for this sort of thing, but interesting to look at because it functions like a market. If you look at InTrade, when Romney was at 72% as recently as 3 weeks ago, and Gingrich I think was at 12%, and those numbers have come to near parity, and I think that's about right. I mean, I think that's reflective of where it is. I really do think it's close to a toss-up, but at the end of the day, I'm a schizophrenic about it. I just realized that 10 seconds ago I said Romney's still got to be the favorite. I don't know. I mean, I'm supposed to offer something that approaches expert opinion on this, and it's just I really can't. I can't wrap my mind around the shape that the race has taken.
Right. I mean, I just think Romney's an incredible. I mean, maybe again. I mean, I'm looking at it with the wrong eyes. You talk about people, Democrats being like sort of comfortable with somebody like Huntsman. Maybe that's true. I mean, but I don't think that it's just my effete liberalism that makes me just find Mitt Romney just a dislikable person. And I don't know. I mean, there's just nothing. There's a real lack of authenticity in a way that's it's not so much the shifting of positions. There's just nothing you can really grab onto and feel like he's a real person. I mean, I always think the example of when he says when his family sat down to to decide whether to run for president, and his wife Ann said, "Well, the thing is, Mitt, it's really just important for this country that we have somebody who's been a small businessman in the White House." And we're supposed to believe that was their breakfast table conversation, as if any married couple actually speaks like that to each other. I just think it's ridiculous, and I think he's just not. I just think there's a core sense in which he's just not really likable. That's really gonna kill him.
There was this Bret Baier interview that he did last week that he took a lot of crap for, and Jonah Goldberg here wrote, I think, a really good, and he was on the panel with Baier right after that interview, and he wrote a good take on it, and I thought it was a disastrous interview too. See, and I bring it up because I would have kind of mildly disagreed with you and thought, he's not the most likable guy, but he's so bland and so sort of unoffensive that I think that's enough against such in an environment like this, against an incumbent who's got a lot of trouble. Right. But that interview kind of showed the cracks in Romney, because it'd be one thing if he were just this milquetoast boring guy, and it was milquetoast all the way down, like they say, it's turtled all the way down. If it were milquetoast all the way down, but in fact he's got this little nasty streak that came out in the interview, and he was huffy and visibly annoyed. And Rich Lowry here pointed out that there was a moment where he kind of crossed his legs and smoothed his pants trousers and looked like the most annoyed person in the world with some of these questions Bret Baier was asking. And he as I put it, on immigration stuff, without even needing to get into the specifics of what his position was, I mean, he was basically defending. He was describing a version of amnesty that he's supported in the past and continues to support, and then saying it wasn't amnesty. I mean, it was as bald and simple as that. Right. And he sounded on that issue, as I said at the time, the way Romney haters, caricaturize him as sounding as a flip-flopper, and so
he has to explain and legalize he has to make everything actually fit together in these ways that don't make any sense, and then he gets a little huffy if you don't understand how it makes sense. To me, it's like and we'll get horrible comments about this, but there was some truth to the Al Gore as a little bit of a both a flip-flopper and a kind of exaggerator about what he was up to, and a kind of legalizer, a kind of, rationalizer. To me, Romney is Al Gore times 30, on that kind of scale. And it's like, you're an idiot if you don't understand how this position on global warming is compatible with this other position.
That might be
a little bit of his tone.
If that's true, it's definitely going to be relevant in the general, and I think Obama's going to be able to exploit it. In the primary, though, that's another interesting thing about the emergence of Gingrich, is that if we're talking about a two-man race, which is what it certainly looks like, then both the major knocks on Romney heretofore have to be neutralized. The whole Washington insider establishment type thing, that has to be neutralized, although somewhat mitigated, as I said, by the distinction between an insider and an establishment guy. And the flip-flopping thing has to be neutralized, especially on the individual mandate. I mean,
right.
Because Gingrich did, in fact, support a federal mandate. Whereas I actually kind of buy that. I mean, is it a semantic distinction? But it is. But in that Bret Baier interview, he said, they have him quoted as saying, "I'd like to see something like this tried throughout the nation or across the nation." Well, there's, if you believe, if you're a Federalist, then there's actually a plausible reading of that, in which he's saying exactly what he says. What he says now, he was saying then, which is that I think it might be a good solution for some other states, but I'd never try and impose it at the federal level.
Right.
So
right. But to grab onto the language where you say the mandate is, an encroachment on liberty for individuals, it's not, it's equally an encroachment on individuals, whether it comes from your state government or your federal government.
I mean, probably not the point in the conversation to get into an argument about federalism, but I mean,
No, I mean, you can make a federalism argument. It just can't be the same kind of grand moral liberty argument that is now being made about the mandate.
Well, no, I just think that the farther away from you, and a lot of Federalists think the same way, a lot of conservatives, I should say, who believe in federalism think the same way, that the farther away the government is from you, the less of a hold it should have on you, the less it should be able to force you to do. Right. And this is just not the sort of thing that federal governments are good at, micromanaging, in the same way that they're not good at micromanaging education policy, or they're not good at micromanaging even welfare programs, and why I support block granting for Medicaid. It's on a lot of these issues, and it's a real dynamic. It's not just a convenient. I don't think you'd probably disagree, but I don't think it's a convenient bit of political language. On a lot of these issues, you're seeing, Paul Ryan, villain, hero of the rich, evil, greedy Republicans, villain of the progressives, is basically not that. I mean, this might make your blood boil, but I think he's broadly similar vision of the importance, size, and scope of the social safety net as Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I mean, I don't think we ran a cover. We ran a cover with Ryan as Roosevelt a few months ago. It's one of my favorites. And I think Ryan has said explicitly out loud, we need a well-tailored social safety net for the poor and the destitute and the people who can't help themselves. And that's sort of how. And so the federalism comes into play because let's block grant Medicaid. Let's make more individual choice. Move towards premium support on Medicare. On education, let's get Washington out of the out of the back pocket of School Board 126 in rural Texas. I mean, these are real Federalist arguments. I don't think it's just convenient political language. And so, on the Romney thing, the real issue is whether Romney believes it, because I think it's a perfectly valid distinction that he's making. So the knock on Romney is not that there's not a Federalist argument for doing Romney care and opposing Obamacare. That is, I've always seen as a real viable argument. The question is,
and frankly, I think I do. I think I probably do too.
Yeah,
that there is an argument that says let Massachusetts try it, and then other states can do that if they want to. If I wouldn't, it's not my argument, but yeah, that's legitimate.
Yeah, and so getting back to what we were talking about, the question for Romney is, does he buy it, or is he just saying what's necessary to say at the time? And and I really don't know. But I thought that coming to Romney kind of late, because frankly, I wasn't a Romney expert in 2008. He was not my guy. I wasn't doing this every day for a living, so I've gotten to know Romney sort of retroactively and become more intimately familiar with him retroactively. I never saw the dislikable thing. I thought he's a nice-looking guy. He's kind of corny, but as Michael Barone, I think, made a great argument that he basically missed the 1960s culturally and physically, in the sense that he was spending a lot of time in rural France in the 60s and at Brigham Young. So I never saw the dislikable piece of it, but there is this it's so cliched at this point, but the robotic thing and the best example of it from that interview, which really I could write a dissertation on, is when Bear asks him what his favorite book is, or what he's reading right now. And Romney says, he smiles and he says, well, I'm reading a sort of fun one right now, so let's skip that. I just read Decision Points by George W. Bush. And as Jonas said, you're Mitt Romney. We want to hear about the fun book you read.
Yeah.
You're not. And instead, as Jonas said, it's like Romney bot was computing the exact right answer. The exact correct answer for the situation, and saying I was reading George W. Bush's autobiography.
Right,
so that's very frustrating, and you wonder if it's a matter of just not having the right strategist, or what it is, or if there's somebody who can produce a more human version of Mitt Romney in general. I don't know. Right.
I mean, you obviously you have to show a little bit of yourself and what you're like. I saw some fun. It was a fun Romney fact. So I was reading that. I was taking out my recycling yesterday, and I actually pulled out Parade magazine for him.
Which is actually how 90% of Parade magazines are read.
Right, in that last stop before recycling. So I read this interview, and he, one of the first things he talks about, he said it was a terrible example. He said it was like, how did your father shape you? And he said, well, what my father, is CEO of American Motor Company, and when he released his tax returns when he was running for president, he everybody knew he could have hired a landscaping company, but instead he made us kids mow the lawn and sweep the yard, which is actually sort of ridiculous, since we all know Mitt Romney did hire a landscaping company.
Mitt did.
Mitt did. His father didn't, but he, it's like these values actually weren't necessarily replicated in the next generation. But the interesting thing was, I was curious about this, and I thought, really, politicians didn't release their tax returns back in the 1960s. That wasn't something that anybody did. And my friend Rick Perlstein, I thought would know about this. I asked him about that over email. And he found he found an article that was totally unprecedented. George Romney released 12 years of his tax returns in 1967, I guess, when he was running for the 1968 nomination. And he released, in 12 years, as CEO of American Motor Company, he made a total in 12 years of $1.2 million in salary, which I just think is, that's what a bygone era.
Net or gross?
Well, it was his reported income, net gross. I'm sorry.
Yes. So that wasn't after the 70% top marginal rate.
No, it was all pre-tax. I mean, that's what he was reporting, and nobody paid that anyway, as you know. But it's such a quaint era when the CEO would make their kids mow the lawn and barely make $100,000 a year.
That is interesting, but I think you would have to agree that is a generational as opposed to an ideological distinction. We're a lot of the more ridiculous elements and less legitimate gripes of the Occupy Wall Street set have to do with things that these people's parents would not have complained about, that in fact they did for themselves. So whether it's working your way through college or going to community school so you can get a little bit better a job, whatever it is, or the example you used, mowing the lawn. I certainly and the most successful people I know, though, are the ones who kind of cut against that grain. I mean, I think of one of my best childhood friends, who's if he's not a millionaire, he will be in about 30 seconds, and he's, my age, 27, Wall Street banker type, but you know what? He worked for the school board every summer, raking leaves and weeding and, mowing lawns, and that, that work ethic, I don't think is and he also voted for Obama in 2008. That work ethic, I don't think, is an ideological thing. It's just something that we're seeing diminished, and I would... Just to leave.
Right. I don't either. I just thought it was funny that of all the examples he might use, that Romney picks the landscaping, and I think that's one of those things that there are times you do it, there are times you don't do it. There's nothing, I don't think it's ideological. I don't even think it's necessarily moral, but you shouldn't, it is good, I think, for families not to take that for granted. I always think, if I ever run for office, my bio is going to say worked his way through college as a janitor, which is more or less technically true. So.
Oh, that's great, yeah.
But but I also think that's, okay, so what? And I'm not doing, it's not like that's what I'm doing now or anything.
Right. Yeah. Well, on the subject of you working your way through college as a janitor, we should probably wrap this up.
It's slightly exaggerated, by the way.
Wait. So I want to know what was it? I
worked as a janitor for about 4 or 5 weeks at the end of the semester, rather than working I worked full time as a janitor for a few weeks at the end.
Yeah, it's better than my resume. I to my great shame, I've never waited at a table, and I've
never waited at a table either.
My mother says that's a real character building experience, and she thinks that I should go and do it at some point. Maybe I will. I'll take a little leave of absence and do it. And as a result, I probably overtip all the time. There's a residual guilt at never having waited at a table.
Well, I think people who do wait tables also say they overtip, and it's shocking. It's shocking how many people have a hard day's or evening's work completely shot by people not tipping, because the minimum wage for tipped industries is only, I think it's in the $2 range.
Yeah, it might be low threes. Yeah,
very,
but it is. Low. Yeah, it is. I've it's important to do that sort of manual labor, if only very briefly. And I've done my share of lugging heavy things too. And that's why I consider myself blessed that I'm sitting in a moderately comfortable desk in a temperature-controlled office.
We're all very fortunate, even if we're not necessarily in the 1%.
We are the 15%,
or not in the 1% yet.
Right. Well, good talking.
Okay, nice to talk to you, Dad. Okay,
Mark, have a good one. Bye.
You too. Bye bye.